I am now going to call our next speaker, Dr. Kay. Dr. Kay is a professor at Georgetown. He's also the president of a CRO, small CRO, Cognitive Research Corporation, that specializes in cognitive issues and problems. And he is going to describe to us, I would say, a saga of repurposing a drug that was called Flibanserin, and that was first...
Flibanserin.
Gary, what?
I'm telling you which slides.
Oh, sorry. His name is Gary Kay. And all the obstacles that had to be overcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. So this is really at quite a different level of drug development than we've been hearing, and really closer to where the lawyer was talking about what things can occur. I guess that's early in decision making. This is later at the FDA when you're repurposing something which you might not expect that you might have to do. And I've chosen this word carefully. Removing a roadblock in the repurposing of Flibanserin, satisfying a pre-approval requirement for a dedicated driving study. So we're really at a very different level than we've been talking about. So what is Flibanserin? This is we're back to BI. Our first two talks were from BI. But here, this was a drug developed BI, Flibanserin. It's a full agonist 5-HT1A, lower affinity, and an antagonist of 5-HT2A, and antagonist or weak partial agonist of D4. It occupies HT1A and HT2A receptors in vivo at similar levels, and has a low affinity and antagonist for HT2B. And in the rat prefrontal cortex, it preferentially activates HT1A, and it's been described as a norepinephrine dopamine disinhibitor. Now, this is a drug originally developed as an antidepressant by BI, and later BI started to work on this as a drug for a condition which some of you may not be all that familiar with. So this is a condition called hypoactive sexual desire disorder, HSDD. Now, after getting a negative evaluation by the FDA in October 2010, BI dropped its development, and the drug was acquired subsequently by Sprout Pharmaceuticals. How many of you ever heard about this drug? It made quite a bit of news, a lot of it very unpopular. But interestingly, this is the kind of story here. So the condition HSDD, just to give you some background, it had been recognized for a long time as a condition. It was in the DSM-4, which is the psychiatric terminology and criteria, but in DSM-5, it's been changed to a thing called female sexual interest arousal disorder. The criteria, basically, what's changed is there are additional criteria for this FSIAD version of HSDD. And there are articles for, let's say, if you were a pharma company, in terms of what criteria, what endpoints to use if you were actually working in this space. And that was being developed while this drug was going through its approval process. So there were efficacy studies, a total of 3 phase 3s. All of them looked at these co-primary endpoints. They would look at satisfying sexual events, and the other thing they would look at was changes in sexual desire and at distress related to sexual desire. And they did show an increase in the number of satisfying sexual events. They showed reduced distress. Problem was they didn't necessarily hit their endpoints, didn't hit them well. And they were hitting things on secondary endpoints, and subsequently they actually said, well, this should be our primary. And in the third study, they really worked toward hitting the primary. They did hit their primary in the third trial. So the review of the history of this drug, Flibanserin, at the FDA, 2010, the advisory panel recommended against approval. They felt there was inadequate risk-benefit ratio, there were side effects, and insufficient evidence of efficacy, and the CRL was issued, and BI dropped development. Sprout then acquires the drug from BI refiles the NDA in 2013, submitted data for a new phase 3, and from a new phase 3 rather, and they also had several drug-drug interaction studies they submitted. The FDA, still not impressed, responded with a formal dispute resolution and said further studies would be needed. And then we get to the topic of my talk, which is one of these was a study in healthy subjects to determine if flibanserin impairs the ability to drive. Okay? Now, why would that be? Well, flibanserin, I mentioned before, antidepressant. And it's a drug, if you looked at the earlier BI data, had some sedation. So we see a somnolence of 11.2%, fatigue of 9.2%. And in order to reduce that somnolence and fatigue, you go to nighttime dosing. So with this nighttime dosing, it was important to determine if there would be next day residual impairment of your ability to drive. So the drug is going to be recommended for nighttime dosing. What's the impact on next day ability to drive? So in the midst of this is occurring at the time in the context of the FDA developing their draft guidance for how to evaluate the impact of drugs on driving. So I was part of that project and consulting to the FDA. This study ends up being pretty much really follows a template of how one studies whether drugs impair driving according to the FDA guidance. Now, the FDA guidance basically is there because the FDA felt that a systematic effort necessary to identify drugs that increase the risk of motor vehicle accidents, that's a critical component of assessing drug risk and designing strategies to reduce the risk. You can't rely, I thought this was an impressive point of the FDA guidance, you can't rely on self-report. Nor does the highway patrol officer who pulls you over rely on your self-report about how you were driving. So people aren't very good judges about whether or not their driving is impacted. Some key points about when drugs need to be evaluated. The FDA, and this is highly relevant to this repurposing topic, the FDA said that a driving study may be needed if a drug approved for a particular use is now proposed for a different indication at a different dose or dosing schedule or in a new patient population. That can trigger this requirement. In the past, this was something which would be asked for when you would be studying a drug for treatment of insomnia. So they would say, oh, any of the Z drugs, zolpidem, zopiclone, whatever, they would say, oh, we need you to do a driving study. It wouldn't necessarily even be asked for pre-approval. It might be, often post-approval, but this was a significant change. And so if accumulating data showed that there was a potential for driving impairment, then a dedicated driving study with a higher face validity, more general tests, so they're not going to let you do laboratory cognitive psychomotor testing. They wanted to see a driving study, and such a study, this was really important, in the past with those insomnia drugs, how were those studies conducted? They would typically they were conducted over the road, actually on the highway. You couldn't do this here in Maryland, but you could take people to the Netherlands where they would allow a lot of things that we don't allow, and where we allow now more than we used to, but they would actually take people in a carefully instrumented Volvo and let them drive down the road and measure how much they were weaving. Now the FDA said, well, this could also be done with driving simulators. So you didn't actually have to go, which is a lot better, more controlled than using over the road. So guidance indicated that different driving tests, different scenarios. So if I'm studying sedation, I'm going to give you a very boring, monotonous 100-kilometer drive. If I'm going to be studying, as I've done, ADHD, then I'm going to give challenging decision-making and impulse control type of driving situations. So the situations or scenarios in which you're driving are specific to the kind of thing I'm looking for. Dedicated driving studies should include a positive control and be placebo-controlled as well. So what's the study? Here's the example. We're back to example. Now here's getting past this regulatory roadblock, the Flibanserin Dedicated Driving Study. We conducted randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, 4-period crossover study assessing next day residual effects of flibanserin on simulated driving performance in healthy premenopausal female volunteers. This is the population for which the drug was going to be indicated. Subjects were 72 healthy premenopausal females, 18 to 50 years of age, mean age of 48. The study was completed in a 4-month period, which was made the sponsor very, very happy. So this was a single center. We actually brought, I think, 7 of our driving simulators to a site, and this was placebo-controlled, Latin square, 4-period crossover. Women 18 to 50 years of age were randomized to either flibanserin. They received both 100 milligram, which is the therapeutic dose, and a super threshold, double that dose, to look at what would happen at a higher dose. The comparison drug for assay sensitivity, zopiclone. Most of you know of that drug in the U.S. as S-zopiclone, which is Lunesta. In Europe, Canada, zopiclone is the drug. Or matching placebo in the evening prior to testing. So they were dosed at night. We tested them the next morning. Zopiclone, as I said, was the positive control for assay sensitivity. We looked at acute dose effect after the initial dose, which is a common way to do these studies. And then we looked at chronic dose effect. So after a week of dosing at the therapeutic 100 milligram dose, to look at the super threshold, after they would come in for a week, we would give them a single time, the 200 milligram dose, because we didn't have a lot of safety data on that 200. Study medication dosed at bedtime. We woke them up after 7 hours of sleep, and then we did cognitive testing. We did self-report testing and the drive. And the drive basically has a primary endpoint called standard deviation of lateral position. To basically translate that to English, it's weaving. We call weaving. So basically what you do is you look at the lane position somebody may maintain, and it could be anywhere in this lane, more to the left, more to the right, but you look at the variability, the consistency in the person's ability to maintain that lane position. And we have very good data for various doses of alcohol, benzodiazepines, diphenhydramine, you name it. We've got data about how much that increases, and that relates to crash risk. So it does correlate very well to important driving endpoints. But this is what the FDA looks for, is this SDLP, if you're looking at sedation. So the studies, basically, you had acute dose, then 9 hours, you did your drive, and then for the chronic dosing, it would be 7 days of dosing, and then they would get their drive, come back for a washout, and then go into the next treatment phase. So again, we had the 4 different treatment phases: placebo, the 2 doses of flibanserin, and zopiclone. So the driving simulator we used is the driving simulator we call, our company CRC, Driving Simulator MiniSim. It's a fully standardized, validated PC-based driving simulator, which is we really put together for doing pharmaceutical research. Most simulators are used for training purposes, to train people. This is actually measures very carefully changes in performance. It consists of a driving cockpit with a full-size steering wheel and an automobile seat. All of it meets NHTSA standards. In fact, this simulator was built for the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration to do driving research. It presents a highly immersive, realistic driving environment. You have the roadway presented on 3 video screens in front of you, about the size of a windshield. You have a separate dashboard, your steering wheel, your pedals. And basically, it was developed by our colleagues at the University of Iowa, the National Advanced Driving Simulator, which is actually a full motion simulator. And I'm going to show you a picture of the simulator here. This basically shows you've got your roadway up here. This is kind of the operator terminal, which normally is behind. Full-size steering wheel, pedals, dashboard. And actually, the steering wheel vibrates as you hit certain things. It has motion in it and also kind of surround sound, so also helping make it a more realistic experience. Scenarios exist for looking at sedation, inattentiveness, or executive function, and we extract the endpoints. We produce a data file of 600 megabytes for 100 kilometers of driving. That goes into MATLAB, gets analyzed to the pre-specified driving endpoints, and there's a lot of to meet 21 CFR 11, a lot of validation scripts when we send our simulators to sites that basically showing that they're producing identical data across simulators. Now, we've done studies showing sensitivity to things like low-dose alcohol, which is often used by the FDA as a comparison point. They'll often look at sedation. Well, how does this compare to a 0.08 or 0.05 BAC? We've shown comparability to over the road. You can look at our data from Zopiclone over the road and on the simulator, and we have comparable results. And we've shown result sensitivity to depressants, stimulants, and drugs that improve your driving as well. So basically, the results of the Flibanserin study was that the SDLP, if it gets worse, if you're weaving more, SDLP goes up. That's what the FDA was worried about. What happened in this study? Significantly decreased. So women taking Flibanserin drove significantly better. So you can see this is the decrease in their SDLP and at both acute and steady state with Flibanserin. It did not have any effect as well on other driving parameters like how many times you went out of your lane, your ability to control your speed, if you went too fast into turns. There's a number of other driving endpoints we measure. We saw no impairment on any driving endpoint. We saw no differences on neurocognitive testing that we do at the same time in psychomotor performance, and we also do your self-report of sleepiness. There were no differences shown between the 100 milligram and the 200 milligram, further adding to the safety profile. But for our assay sensitivity compared to placebo, Zopiclone, very commonly used sleep agent, probably the most commonly used sleep agent for occasional problems with insomnia in Europe and Canada. This drug actually had a significant increase, about equal to a 0.05 blood alcohol level. That's about where you're driving the next morning when you're heading to work for your commute after taking Zopiclone. We have some number of Europeans here, so I got to worry on your highways with all these folks taking Zopiclone. But here's the result. This is the change, the difference from placebo. This line here shows you what a 0.05 BAC would be. So this is looking at Flibanserin 100. This is Zopiclone. So Zopiclone, you got a lot of folks over that 0.05. There's a couple of cases here, and this would be zero change. So most people are actually getting better on Flibanserin. Okay. This is looking at Flibanserin 100. This is with chronic dosing. The 200 milligram, no different, and this is Zopiclone again on day 8, showing you even with chronic, people are still showing this impairment with the Zopiclone. So basically, this is showing you the size of the effects at 7.5 and 100 versus placebo. This is the 100 versus 200 Zopiclone, and the results are as I described. So the conclusion of the study was that bedtime administration of Flibanserin at doses up to 200 did not impair next day cognitive function or driving performance. This got submitted to the FDA. As I said, this was a requirement for them. And their briefing document from 4 June 2015 for the advisory committee meeting, this is quoted from them. They say, results demonstrate that therapeutic and supra-therapeutic doses of Flibanserin had no negative effect on measures of next day simulated driving performance that were evaluated. Here's the division comment. The negative findings of the next day driving impairment are reassuring, something that any sponsor would like to see this word. And for me, it was a very boring day at the advisory committee sitting, waiting to be called upon and never getting called upon. They never wanted to talk to me. So on June 4th, that committee meeting was held. The committee recommended approval of the drug. Several months later, August 18th, the FDA approved ADDY, which is Flibanserin, for treatment of premenopausal women with low sexual desire that causes personal distress or relationship difficulties. And the approved label basically describes the study and came out with very favorable language with respect to driving safety. So this was my opportunity to talk about a project we did as a CRO in repurposing and a new hurdle, if you're a drug manufacturer, if you're in pharma, another hurdle, but I think a good hurdle for public safety in looking at medications with respect to driving safety. So anyway, thank you for your attention. A little bit of a different topic here for us. Thank you.
Thank you.